Welcome all. Thank you. It's so terrific to see this full room. I'm Kate Cagney, the director of the Institute for Social Research here at the University of Michigan. I'm so glad you could join us for our ISR Insights Speaker Series. The Insights Speaker Series is a forum for our faculty to share their research to inform the public good. And I always feel like I have to give a bit of a preamble for those who are visiting from outside ISR, but just to remind, we're 300 affiliated faculty who conduct research that addresses topics such as wealth and inequality, race and racism, politics, public opinion, as well as a wide range of other topics, including teen drug use, economic behavior, aging and health, and also educational attainment. We'll learn about that in a moment. Just to note, a full schedule of our Insights talks is available on the ISR website, as well as recordings of past talks in the series. We'll post a video of today's events there as well, so you can review, right? the Q&A or any important aspects of Pam's talk. Today, I very much have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Pam Davis-Kean. Pam is the director of the Survey Research Center at ISR. Thankfully, and we're so happy to have her direction, particularly in these moments. She's also chair of developmental psychology in LSA, the associate director of MIDAS in the University of Michigan Office of Research, and the founding director of the Population Neurodevelopment and Genetics Program at ISR. So let me tell you a little bit about Pam's research. She examines the various pathways that socioeconomic status of parents relate to the outcomes of their children. Primary focus is on parental educational attainment, how it can influence the development of the home environment throughout childhood, adolescence, and the transition to adulthood. So today she's giving her third Insights talk on education. So we applaud that, right? Thank you, Pam. As schools struggle to improve teaching, and certainly coming out of the pandemic, thinking about math and attainment in that area, actually research shows very little change. And so I think Pam will provide some insight about that. She'll review her research seeking to understand developmental pathways of math achievement, including issues involving the struggle with learning loss, and again, particularly related to the pandemic. So we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. I'm sure Pam would take a clarifying question throughout. So please enjoy. Thank you so much for participating today, and join me in welcoming Pam.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. So my job for the next hour is to totally distract everybody on anything but thinking about math with me, or maths, as my colleagues in the UK like to refer to it. So the first slide I have is up here because Tuba said to me, I didn't know that you looked at math achievement. So this is the word cloud from my Google Scholar, which is achievement is my primary outcome that I look at in general. But I'm a little bit of a chameleon on everything that I look at, and somewhat surprising to many people, also heavily involved in just survey research. For a psychologist, not really the number one thing we do, but it's because I look at really large population studies and have for my entire career here. So that's why things are a little bit interesting. This is my third. I was the originating ISR Insights speaker. I'm running out of things to talk about, so I'm not sure I can do 4 and 5, but you can see kind of I could do a whole thing on parenting because I also look at parenting as well as child development. But today I'm going to talk about an area that I would say a lot of people don't know. I spent most of my career looking at specifically math achievement, and there are reasons for that. I'm sorry this is smaller than I thought it was going to be. Thankfully, of all the things we've heard about since the beginning of January, and this is also not great news, but we also heard from the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress in the United States. Their most recent results came out. This has been tracked it's a cross-section that's tracked every few years that tells us how people across the United States, a representative group across the United States, are doing in education. And again, I think maybe just follow the lines if you can't follow the numbers here, that this is 8th grade and this is 4th grade. So They look at 4, 8, and 12. They did not release the 12th grade one this year, so I wasn't able to show that to you. But the learning loss, I'm going to walk a little bit around here. You can see this was before 2020, this was after, and that's what people have been referring to as the learning loss. And then this was 2024, which was just released. The big headlines that came out were reading. This is math, but reading took a much more significant dip than math did. Math is held. I will say math has never been like, yay, we're really doing great in math. And so part of this is probably like we stayed the same, and it was good that we didn't dip more. Whereas reading, we've generally been doing pretty well in, and we did not do, and we're seeing actually continued decline. Like we don't expect in achievement to see continued declines. We expect to see them going forward, and we're not seeing that. So in the case of math, we went down. It wasn't as much as we went down in reading, but we're not seeing this kind of dramatic up. One of the parts that they parse out here that's kind of important is the differences in the 90th people at the 90th percentile, the average, and then those at the bottom. This difference, and it is related to socioeconomic status differences, has kind of held. Like everyone said, oh, well, the highest performers will do fine. They won't really have this learning loss. That's not what we saw. We saw learning loss across every group. We continue to see problems across every group, but at least in the 2025, we see the 90th percentile beginning to look like they're popping a little bit back up in math. So that was encouraging, but let me just, for those of you who are maybe looking at these numbers, it went from 325 to 328. I'm not sure I'm going to throw a party over those numbers, but they didn't go down. I mean, so that's a positive. So math, we've been struggling in for a long time. Reading, we have too. It just doesn't come up as often as math does. These are the reading ones, in case you want to have a look at these. This is 8th grade and 4th grade. These are the ones that they are concerned about. Everyone thought, here's why people were concerned. Everyone thought reading was going to be okay. They thought at least kids would be reading in the home, and so reading would not take the hit that math would take. And it was the case that math took a much more significant hit early on, but they thought reading would recover, and reading hasn't recovered. And I think that's what they've been really concerned about, is not seeing these numbers go up. So that's kind of the state of education that we're in since COVID. You can see the lines have been pretty stable, and I just want to point out that stability may not also be something we're comfortable with. We have a ton of interventions in reading. If there's anything that is funded pretty substantially, are interventions in reading, and they've been going on a long time. And you can see it's not really moving any of these lines. So people at the highest 90th percentile are staying about where they are. Those at the lowest are staying where they are. And actually in the most recent one, they're going even further down. So this is pretty serious in the state of Michigan. Before COVID, we had at 3rd grade, and it's being talked about again, if you were not at proficiency in reading at 3rd grade, you were held back another year. At COVID, they released that state policy so that people weren't being held back. They're talking about that again. What do we do if people are not proficient in reading at 3rd grade? So this continues to be an ongoing discussion here, but also in the United States in general. This is just another way of looking at the math scores. This, to me, seemed better than some of the lines. Plus, the lines kind of insinuate longitudinal, and those are all cross sections. So just to kind of look across the time. This was the information that's come out really recently in the New York Times. Youngest pandemic children are now struggling in school. Schools face a math problem, money's running out, and kids are still behind. So this was about the COVID money that went to all the states in order to help schools recover. Schools haven't recovered. The kids, I should say this, the kids haven't recovered within the schools. So it's still low, it's still problematic, they're still struggling. I'll tell you that at college level, because people never really talk about higher education, we're seeing that as well. We've had more accommodation requests at the University of Michigan than we have ever seen before in our classrooms. to the point where it's overwhelmed the faculty who are teaching the intro classes because we have so many students coming in that have accommodation requirements. So it's just going all the way up the education sector. And it will continue because we have many years of students, many cohorts of students that got stopped kind of at COVID, and all of that is just rolling through the education system. So again, it's not just K through 12 that's dealing with this, we're also dealing with it in the college system. Think about that as the 90th percentile, 85 to 90th percentile group, still struggling even as they transition into college. All right, this is PISA. So the PISA scores are the international group that we always look at. I can tell you just in general, we never look well in math internationally. And you can kind of see this here. This is the average, this is us. We generally look good in reading, but we also fell internationally in reading. Still, we're falling pretty dramatically as well. The only thing that made us look better kind of in the percentage is that all the other countries were also going down. So as you can see, we don't look quite as bad here as we normally look, but we didn't look great. And that's generally what is true internationally and has been for a long time. The top countries are always Singapore. Let's see if I have my whole list here in my notes. I don't. I might have it here. Yes. So we mirrored the OECD trends. Despite the drop in math scores, our rankings didn't change much because everybody else dropped. It's the case that the top performers like Singapore are more than 100 points higher than what we see on average in the US, and that's been standard for a while. So again, we generally look okay in reading. We've never looked all that great in math across, and we haven't really moved. We kind of stay in the same kind of ranking order, except for this year when everybody saw losses. All right, why is it important? Does anyone care about math at all? And we're going to get back to that because, well, I'll ask everybody this question. So this is when you can talk. If you are in school and you don't do well in first grade, so you're taking your kid's reading in first grade, what happens to your kid if they're showing issues in reading in first grade? I know you guys have kids. They go into reading recovery programs. Every single state has reading recovery programs. Every single school provides reading recovery programs. So for those of you who are worried about the Department of Education going away, one of the biggest things they fund are these reading recovery programs. What happens, all right, you didn't know the answer to that one, but maybe you'll know the answer to this one. What happens when you don't do well in math in first grade, when you're struggling in math? Can't count. There is, I see at least people. No, there is literally no intervention whatsoever in any of our schools regarding math. If you are not doing well in math, you simply go to the next grade. And that's exactly how it occurs. There is no federal intervention, generally no state, sometimes districts, but generally no districts, sometimes by school, interventions of math. But there is no federal monies that go in to doing any type of intervention on math that don't come through grant money. Nothing systematic like there is for reading. So why does it matter? Fundamental math skills are a primary distinguishing predictor of youth who ended their educational career as a college degree. So math, in case you didn't know this at University of Michigan or all universities, is one of the #1 criteria that they distinguish for who comes into college and who doesn't. Part of that is because we can't really use language or reading because those come in at very high scores, and so they use math as kind of a determining factor. So it's one of the major factors in getting into college, your ability to do math. It also has these outcomes. The better you are at math, the higher your income is generally, creates these widening gaps. We can see this with things like computer science or AI coming in now, people who have to get trained with high amounts of math. And then, this is Greg Duncan, by the way, research using multiple US and international data sets indicate the early math skills strongly predict the future academic success. So these are all coming from economic finding of why math distinguishes more than reading does and why it's a stronger predictor across the lifespan for outcomes like employment. This is research that I did with Justin Jagger These are trajectories. And what I really want you to know from here, this was looking for trajectories of math. We also did this for reading across different groups in the United States. And the big issue, and I'll come back to this over and over again, is that a lot of people talk about the achievement gap. They zone in on K through 12, and they blame the schools for the achievement gap. And the achievement gap exists coming into schooling. It's not one, it doesn't get better. And actually, we should be concerned about that. This is about catching up. Some do catch up. You can see some groups kind of going over, but you can see these massive gaps that hold. They hold all the way through schooling. So the achievement gap, not a school gap. These are on the rise in general, which we hope to see that you actually are getting more achievement across time. We would hate to see those flatten too much, but kind of look at this one. It's beginning to start going in a very flat area, which means no additional knowledge kind of coming in on these math achievement scores. These folks are probably topped out at not even algebra, even though you can't graduate in Michigan without having at least Algebra 1 or get a high school diploma without having Algebra 1. Most people that are taking Algebra 1 are not actually doing Algebra 1 related work that are coming out with high school diplomas. But you can see these kind of differences across all the different groups. So why do these early skills matter? So for those of you who aren't steeped in education, we have a lot of wars going on. We have reading wars. You might have heard about this recently. There's a lawsuit by some family members to some New York researchers who had a reading program, which was the primary one that was used in New York, that was showing no changes in reading. In fact, it didn't come from any actual science, but it had dominated. There's the number one kind of tension that goes on in schools is between phonics skills and whole word learning. Whole word learning is cat, and you keep pointing at cat, and you're learning the word, and phonics is the sounding out. So that kids, when they're presented with novel words, can sound out and learn the new word by doing that. Research for years, and one of this was done by my colleague Fred Morrison, who's now retired, basically showed if you didn't have phonics skills, you struggled in reading all the way through until you were taught phonics skills. And then you were able to move to whole word. Some of the problems of kids who are coming in already with phonics skills is they were also doing well with whole word, but they also had already had phonics laid down before they started formal schooling. So this is one of the problems we've had. These reading wars I thought were done, they've come back, and they're still ongoing as far as how reading should be taught. And again, let me just reference you to the fact that we went down in reading again in our national assessment that we just did. The math wars are basic skills versus problem solving skills. So everyday math is the famous problem solving that you shouldn't teach kids, you shouldn't memorize, you should teach them how to problem solve. They should estimate. This came out of the University of Chicago, this everyday math problem solving one, versus traditional math, which is memorization, practice solving equations over and over and over. If anyone has their kids in Kumon, you know that Kumon is like do it 20,000 times and maybe you'll get it. It's just kind of repetitive, learning how to solve the problem. Everyday math was supposed to allow for this idea that if you estimated, if you problem solved, it would carry over, like you'd be able to do novel ones. So far, the evaluations of everyday math have shown no change in kids' math ability compared to traditional math. And in California, there's a Berkeley-Stanford war going on between two researchers of math in those two universities who are yelling at each other pretty significantly about math-related ones because the state of California picked up a kind of more problem-solving one versus traditional math one as their primary one. And because California and Texas dominate textbooks, they're the ones who buy the most. They're also the ones who kind of dominate the curriculum. How California or Texas goes in curriculum has a tendency to shift everybody else because the publishers just publish a ton of that and people just pick it up. So this has been kind of an ongoing issue. It's still an ongoing issue. We have a lot of kids. I'm not saying memorization is great where we all had to go learn our times tables, but we have kids who don't kind of have a sense of times tables now because they do this estimation, and it takes a little bit longer than basic memorization. My fun part about this is everyday math only goes until 6th grade. And then when you go to 7th grade, you go to traditional math. So then you don't have the skills to do algebra, which is still taught exactly the same way because you were taught in this different way for problem solving. So then you see this time point around junior high, around 7th grade, where this is incredible disjunct between what the kids were just taught and now what they're being taught regarding algebra, because that never moved into this kind of everyday math problem solving. So just to show how curriculums can mess up everything. But that's kind of where we are with math. And so the way that I go, because I study parenting, there's a lot of different ways that I look at math, and I'm about to run through all of those. But one of the things I did that's much more of my, I'm not a qualitative person, but more on the qualitative side, I'm much more of the quantitative, was to say, okay, so if these achievement gaps are occurring before schooling, then what is happening in the home that might be promoting? Like, why are we seeing some kids come into K through 12 or the learning environment, and they actually have pretty impressive math skills and they do pretty well, and why are we seeing less? And so part of this is, what are they hearing? What are they doing in the home? What kind of activities they're doing in the home? And so does it matter what you say in the home regarding math? Now, many of you are probably suggesting you don't talk about math in the home. We'll review. So how do families talk about it, and how does math talk in a naturalistic context like the home environment vary across families with different educational levels? So what we did is there's this device called the Lena device. It's actually being used primarily for reading, but we were using it for this case to try to hear what parents were saying to their kids in the home environment and what kids were hearing. So there was one of these devices on the parent, one of these devices on the child. We call it kind of the talk pedometer. It has 16 hours worth, and so we just would tell them to wake up in the morning, turn this on, and then turn it off at night. And so we collected all of this data. In fact, we still have one day that has not been transcribed. It's so tedious to transcribe all this, but we have 2 days, one weekend day and one weekday that's transcribed to see how parents are talking with their kids. These are the kind of things we looked at. This was the coding scheme. This is based on other coding schemes where people went into homes and they kind of gave them tasks. Normally what we do is we give parents and kids tasks, and then we watch and see what parents and kids did. We didn't want to see what it looked like as an experiment where we like kind of forced educational materials on the parent, and then the parent interacted with them and the kid, which is kind of the common way the experiments are done. Instead, we just wanted to hear, what do they talk about naturally in the home? So these were the kind of things we were looking for. We wanted to know how long, how much, what was the complexity. So we were looking at all that. This Lena device also has some really nice automatic data that comes out. It has conversational turns, so we know if the parent is initiating or the kid is initiating. Just as a side note, for math, it's almost always the parent initiating. For reading, it's the kid. So the kid will initiate reading by saying, "Mom, Dad, can you read this book to me?" And we see a lot more initiation from the kid on reading than we see on math. It usually comes from the parent to the kid. This is basically what we heard. The majority of the time is naming numbers. This is 3, this is 4. We had ordinal numbers, time, counting, and fractions. So fractions, where do you think fractions primarily come in the home? Yes, and cooking. So we picked up a ton of cooking where they're saying, show me where, pour that to the half, pour that to the whole, it's 1 cup. So you hear a lot of that going on in homes where they're doing cooking together. The majority of the time, so we were able to look across, this Lena recorder tells us when all the actual talk is happening. The majority of talk between parents and kids happen, what do you think? What time of day? It's dinner. So the majority of the time happens around during meal events. People thought going to bed at night. That's not true. In fact, what it usually is are parents, by majority, talking to the kid. So very directive talk, get your pajamas on, get in bed. There's not much of the kids responding during that time. And then we had a reviewer on our paper say, but isn't it the time between dinner and bedtime when there's the majority of conversation between the parent? And the answer is no. What do you think happens during that time? TV and watching stuff. So it was really around mealtime is when the majority of the talking goes on, just in general, not even just about math, but talking in general between the parents and the kids. All right, so this was kind of complexity, how complex it was, basic skills, who initiates it, the mother, and who dominated it, it was the mom. So this was just going over kind of that general part. The majority is naming numbers. We broke it down by higher education and lower education. This is a pretty small sample. It's a pretty big sample for qualitative, but it's about 40. And man, did we fight to get those families. People don't love when we say we want to listen to them all day long. So it took a while to even get the numbers we got. We were happy to get 40 families participating. So you can kind of see there are some differences with naming numbers being in the higher educated area. And if you look at fractions, more in the higher educated families. All right. Parents, especially lower educated parents, are using this as a primary teaching method at home. A lot of people said to us that, I don't use numbers, I don't talk about math. I think people think we're always talking about like formal things when you sit down and say 2 + 2 is 4. But there is a lot of conversation in the home from all different groups. 88%, so this was a big deal. So in kindergarten, when your kid transitions into kindergarten, one of the primary curriculum activities is counting. And they will spend a significant amount of curriculum time teaching your kid to count. But what we have found out from this and multiple other studies is that 88% of children entering kindergarten already know how to count. It is the majority of what they do. There certainly are kids that don't know how to count and you want to teach them to count. But if you think about what most kids are getting, they're getting something that they already know and they're not moving on to more complex basic skills. They're just hanging out in the counting area. So what we've seen, if there are teachers who move them to more higher order math, then you actually see kids doing better in math than just doing the repetitive counting that they already know. So it's an important precursor, but it is generally one that you find in all homes and that kids generally have. And so a recommendation coming out of this is that schools should figure out how many kids already have that skill. It's already a skill that they have achieved and are very proficient in, and should think about moving to the next level of math instead of having kindergarten so dominated by teaching counting. All right, transition to school. Do your skills matter? So this was done with a large interdisciplinary group of people. Thad Domina is a sociology of education person. Liz Gershoff actually was here at Social Work, is now at UT Austin running their POP Center. So we got together. I do a lot of these collaborative. One of the things not mentioned is I run a ton of collaborative centers. This was one of them. And can we predict who will go to college track before school entry? So think about this. Prior to even entering K through 12, can we predict by just looking at math skills whether or not you're going to go to college attendance? Right? Pretty crazy question. I don't think we should be able to do that. But if you look at those trajectories I showed you, there's some indication that the stability in what kids know is there pretty early on and doesn't change across time. We should all be sad about that, but that's kind of the way it is. So we want to look at this. Are there skills that you learn in your home environment prior to transition, or I could say also your daycare or childcare environment prior to starting schooling, that tells us something about where you're going to be later in your educational career? So what we looked at was predicting kind of Algebra 1. So I'm going to have to take you guys through this. So at 54 months of age, these kids took the Woodcock-Johnson, which is an achievement test. We were able to go in, and I'm going to show you another study where we were able to do this. Because we had item information, we were able to take apart the assessment into different parts of, like, was it counting? Was it counting and subtracting? So we were able to actually look at the skills that kids were doing to figure this out. So we were able to say this kid was proficient and capable of doing counting, but not higher order other skills. These kids were able to do counting and subtracting, but not other skills. These kids were able to do counting, subtracting, and adding. And they were fine at all the other ones. So we got these distinctions that were made. This was done with this kind of complicated modeling of trying to separate into groups. And these were kind of the groupings we had. So if you can imagine, we have a set of kids. It's not a non-substantial set of kids that already know how to count, subtract, and add prior to entering school. And those are but we also have a very large amount of kids with no skills entering schools, not even basic counting skills. So that's important to know. So if you had at 54 months, no discernible math skills that we could capture with the Woodcock-Johnson, then you were most likely to end your time in high school with Algebra 1 being the highest level of math that you took. If you had counting, you had geometry. If you had counting and subtracting, you were going to have Algebra 2. And if you had counting, subtracting, and adding, advanced math and calculus was generally what you had as your final math course in high school. So again, this is consistent with these trajectories. What you know before coming in creates this gap, and that gap stays standard, and it predicts to later on. And your final course selection. And then this is your post-secondary plans. And you can see that we have this very kind of linear looking one that if you're counting, subtracting, and adding, you're more likely to go to a four-year college. Again, there was variation. So it's not like you can't catch up with different math skills, but it looks pretty standard on these kind of, what I hate are linear. I'd like to see more jumping around, but these kind of more linear things. So does it matter what you know before you come in? It does matter. It matters for a long time. And I really don't think I should be able to look at 54 months and be able to predict where you're going to be later on, but I can. And that's what we were able to do with this particular study. These are just some more of the ability groupings, if you want to see that. Math skills, these were 4.5 to college. This is just another, you can see the percentages. Four-year college is 76% with people who had the counting. All right, so the skills during schooling matter. So again, this is me kind of longitudinally trying to figure out what's going on, what we need to do, why it matters across math, why we have math problems. Do individual differences in elementary school students' fraction knowledge matter for algebra knowledge, and does it matter for total math? So this was another large group. You can see Greg Duncan on here. Actually, Mei Chu Chen, who's with PSID, is also an author on this. This is from the PSID, as was actually the first one as well. And so in this one, this was kind of an interesting one. Bob Siegler, the first author on this, was at the National Academy of Education. They were setting the new criteria for the Common Core on math skills. And they wanted to put in that, as everyone knows, you need fraction skills prior to algebra skills. So you have to be proficient in fractions in order to do algebra. And they went to cite that really important paper that said that, or series of papers, and no paper actually existed that said that, even though that was a common thing that everyone believed in education. So he knew we had this center that was doing replications across large-scale studies, and asked us if we could actually empirically look at this so that they would have something that they could cite for this very large federal report that they were putting out about what kids should be able to do. So we were able to do that, again, because we have item level information on the Woodcock-Johnson and the PSID. We're able to go in and actually look at items. We can parse them out into various items. And he wanted to know, his big question was, does it matter to have fraction skills prior to algebra? And does it matter for overall math knowledge in general? We looked at not just the panel study, but also the British cohort studies as well, because we wanted to replicate it across 2 different countries. We were able to find in both of these how we were to look at each of these. Sorry, I was thinking this was Alice-Beck, but maybe that's another one. This is what we kind of found. So this is so you're gonna have to kind of remember these numbers. This is the British cohort study. We found that fractions do matter as well. A little aside here. We had to change the ages a little bit because we were trying to figure out when in each country people were actually proficient. And the people in the UK are more proficient at fractions earlier than the US. So we had to adjust slightly so that we could get the same kind of groupings of people in. But the British cohort group is younger than the United States group because we needed to get at least 50% proficient. And it's the US just takes longer to get proficient in these math ones. The kind of really important thing that came out of here is that it did matter for fractions, or at least for Bob, he really cared about that. But it also mattered for division, and that came up as a big new thing that Bob spent a lot of time looking at was division. Now, for those of you who are thinking about fractions, you might say, hey, when 4/8, that's actually a kind of division number, right? So why would division be independently separate? And this had to do with the items. So the items for long division or for division in the Woodcock-Johnson are actually long division ones and not just your easy like 4/8. So it seemed to be getting at a little bit more complicated division than what you would generally assume. Because I was like, but division is a fraction. What are they talking about? But yes, that's what happened. And it replicated in the PSID. So we saw the same type of thing going on. Passage comprehension also mattered. And for me, who looks at parent education mattered. So this is where it replicated, divisions, fractions, not to algebra knowledge at 10 and at 16. And this wasn't the right ages, and it's a little bit of a tweak. But also in the panel study, we found exactly the same thing. What was crazy is that the effect size was very similar as well. So we were just surprised at how closely these two things replicated. So whatever we do poorly or well in the US, the UK also does poorly and well. So we really saw this really interesting, other than they're proficient earlier than the US is in fractions. All right, so I'm going to show you, because I said in my abstract, and I felt bad about this. I have a whole other thing about other math, but I also wanted to, there's this little bit of, I've been studying self-concept of ability kind of all the way through my career. I kind of don't believe it. And so I'm a skeptic of the thing I study, but self-concept of ability means that you actually have efficacy about what you do. Like, I'm really good at math, and you actually believe you're really good at math. And I wanted to show you this because self-concept of ability, which is, a personal individual attribute, and not just a socioeconomic or demographic one, actually is pretty powerful. And no matter what I do, or actually more importantly, Greg Duncan does, we cannot get rid of this effect. It continues to hold out. So there is something about the individual having beliefs about their own ability that stays strong across time. I have some data that suggests that's because you're actually realize you're capable of doing it, and because a lot of people are like, oh, well, how do we let's go tell kids they're good at stuff. That's not really the way it works. They actually need themselves to attribute it to their own ability, and then that's what's predictive, not somebody else telling them they're good at it. So again, another replication, not surprising. You'll hear this from me over and over again because I ran a center that basically replicated things. That's what this is. So another self-concept predicts. This one's on the NICHD child care study, which is over at ICPSR. People use this study a lot. It's a birth cohort. We had this data, I think, all the way. Sorry, and this one's really bad. I could not find. The other ones I've spent time making cuter, and this one I didn't. So I apologize. So I'm just going to let you see, we looked at, this is ALSPAC. So we looked at the ALSPAC in the UK, the NICHD, and the PSID. So we had 1 UK and 2 US data sets. These all vary in kind of interesting ways. ALSPAC and NICHD are more area studies, and the PSID, as you know, is a national study. And again, kind of no matter what we did to try to get rid of these, this is the linear regression up here, and then we looked at quartiles. But the linear regression showed that self-concept of ability in math is predictive of math later on, even more so than reading is. The interesting thing here is that we made predictions ahead of time, and I made predictions that it would only be true for those in the highest quartile of self-concept, like those were the people that you would really see an effect, but we actually also saw it in the lowest quartile. That if you are getting feedback that you're actually doing terrible in math, but you feel like you're doing well in math, you're actually slightly above other people who are also doing terrible in math. So that, I mean, that's kind of an interesting thing. I wouldn't have thought that. I thought it would go along with actual kind of true information as you're seeing your grades coming in, that you're kind of adapting to that. But there is at least some prediction that if you yourself answer the question, I'm better than others in math, I'm really good at math, these are what the questions are that we ask, that you do have a little bit of a pop in your math scores. This is just the 90th. This was the one I predicted. You see it the strongest there. It's not that it wasn't there. It was the strongest in the highest quartiles. And again, it replicated across the studies. All right. So after controlling for demographic variables, child characteristics, early ability, everything we could do to remove the effect that we could think of, self-concept of ability in math and reading predict later achievement in each respective domains across all quantile levels. Sorry, I was saying quartile. Results are produced across these 3 data sets representing different populations. It's robust evidence of the role of self-concept of ability. It's the most robust we've had. We've seen it for a while. I see it in my own data. And again, it's very, very hard to get rid of this effect. So there is some individual effect in there, no matter how we've tried to knock it out. So what are the take-home messages? We're doing pretty well. I have a whole nother set of where we use the Lena and the teacher. So I'll just give you a brief overview of that. We stuck Lena recorders on teachers in the classroom to find out how often they used math. It's a very, very sad study. Very few math teachers in kindergarten actually use math terms. So kids are rarely hearing math in kindergarten in the state here in the state of Michigan. So that was the other one. But I had a student who took the same thing and took it into the classroom to see what we could see. How and when are math skills are acquired? Many of these skills exist prior to formal schooling. That is related to parent educational attainment, which is not some of the work I showed you, but it's important. And so understanding those disparities in these foundational skills early on is important to understand. Making sure children are proficient in early math skills is an important thing for us to think about. Having absolutely no intervention on math, doing very little, moving people forward who have not acquired even the basic like fractions, we just move them forward to the next grade, is not helping them later on. It's not helping us as a community later on not to have really talented people coming into the type of employment we would like them to. There should be early intervention. It's a long way to go in understanding these math skills, as well as understanding the issues of reading and literacy. So reading and literacy has really, really, I would say 50 years of really good experimental work of where people have isolated. How that gets out into the schools is a whole nother question. But we have really good science of reading about what happens with reading. We have almost none of that for math. So if you asked any math person, math cognition person, what are the antecedents of being able to do math, they would struggle to tell you what they are. Because we just don't have that equivalent, where if you ask a reading specialist, they can like start rattling off, well, we know it's about the basics of phonics, it's the base, you know, and there's all kinds of science behind it. We just don't have it with math, because not only is math left out in K through 12, it is generally left out anything we do in the research as well. So it's just been kind of pushed away. And mine is like, bring it back, embrace it. It's not just parents and teachers. Math thinking's acquired just like reading in all context. And I told everyone in the director's office at the survey research I was going to say this. We all have math brains. And I tell you that because, and I hope nobody was going to say this to me in a question, but just because you are not good at math does not mean that you do not have a brain that is capable of doing math. Brains are there to learn, just like reading, and they can also do math. So one of the things we've done across the world, but definitely in the United States, is made math a skill that we think you are born into versus one that you can actually learn. And I think that has done us probably the worst. That, you know, it's the same thing. It's still symbolic. We're telling you one looks like this and is spelled O-N-E. It's the same process that we teach you how to do language, but we've made it as if it's special. Like somehow you have a special math brain that you're capable of understanding these type of things, and nobody else has. And that has done us a terrible disservice for understanding how people learn in general. We are capable of learning lots of things. Math is not special. It's not inherited more than anything else is inherited. It's something that's taught, and that's actually what we saw during COVID. The reason the math kind of trajectories went way down is because it is schooling that's the primary area of which people are taught math. Reading is done primarily in the home. There's really strong reading coming in prior to starting schooling. Math is almost dominated by schooling. Very few people getting, I would say, formal math related training prior to entering schooling. It almost always happens in schooling. So when kids didn't have access to it, that's what they didn't learn, was math. So it's starting to come back as they're doing. I think there's a lot of emphasis on trying to get it back. But at the same time, we do have this severe learning loss that's continuing going forward. That's it. Hopefully I didn't depress you. Questions? Someone's running at you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that one. Thanks. Thinking about the math achievement trajectories, is there research which looks at whether like injecting a child who doesn't know counting with counting skills before kindergarten then like puts them on that upward trajectory? Or is it like the childs who come in with low counting are in circumstances that then end up leaving them in that trajectory? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, so if you were able to intervene and provide counting prior to schooling.
Yeah, does that actually fix the problem?
Right, so it ends up being that counting is a fundamental skill, but it's not the only skill you need to do well. So if that's all you learned and didn't learn higher order math, you would still be kind of on this lower trajectory. But yes, if you had counting prior to entering into schooling, there's a whole group that has no skills, so it would at least put you up a little bit, right?
But I guess my question is like, how do we know that providing the students with no skills, these skills will actually move them up? Or like maybe their circumstances are such that like it's going to be hard for them to stay in that high trajectory their whole life?
Yep. So one, the no skills I'm assuming is just because no one has sat down and taught them. So experimentally, what do we know? There's some things that are called like nighttime math. Like Chicago also has something like this where you read books about math. And they've done some experimentation showing if you do this kind of early work with math, kids are entering more confident and more capable of doing math. So there have been, these are very small experiments, but they've shown some promise for the fact that going in and intervening is possible. We've tried to look at, a lot of us think daycare is one of those kind of interventions. If you get your kid into preschool or daycare, that's going to be the case. But a lot of daycares, especially, maybe not so much preschool-oriented preschools, are not, they're no more talking about this than the parents are talking about it. So they have a tendency to follow along the SES gradient as well. So we didn't see what many of the controls are in here, like, did you go to full-time daycare? And we did not see any prediction out of that. So that would have been like another possible way to have introduced it prior to schooling, other than having the parent do it. But we haven't seen a systematic change. And again, just so you know, in the United States, and many of you know this, that daycare and preschool are all on the socioeconomic status of the individual, except for Head Start, which is also on the socioeconomic status, but in the other direction. And then there's a whole group in between that don't have enough money to pay for either preschool or daycare. So that goes right back into the socioeconomic status situation that we're in.
Thank you.
I was curious, what are other countries doing to improve math skills that we're not? Like, how are they approaching it differently?
Yeah, everybody always asks me, should we just do what Singapore? So there is actually Singapore math. Some of you might have heard that that curriculum exists in this country. It is a lot of repetition. So there's a difference in the way the United States approaches math and the way other countries that perform really high in math do it. I don't know that it's so. If you talk to groups that come, this constant repetition, and it's also schooling isn't just for us. We have it you could get me on a whole thing about how short of time and having 3 months off in the middle of the year is not the way learning happens. But we also have much reduced, and then they go to school and then come home and then go to school again in the evening. So they have a lot of time on task that the United States kids do not do. So the differences are kind of vast. Like you would have to decide that your child is going to be doing this most of the day, every day. And we just don't have that same intensity. We do have people that do very well in math, but I will say a lot of people are like, yeah, but our top performers are still doing pretty well. We're still under the top performers in even our best performers are not performing as high as other countries' best performers are doing. But they're better. I mean, they're at least close.
Pam, given your closing comments, I wonder if you wanted to draw out gender differences at all, and certainly sort of normative orientation toward women adhering to math, and yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of people ask me why I don't show gender. I do actually have a whole set of research on gender and math as well. And the reason why I don't point it out is because a lot of people believe that there's an inherent difference, and currently an inherent difference in math. And the reason it didn't show up in the stuff I was showing you is because the differences in math achievement in the United States for more than 30 years have not existed. Women caught up a long time ago in math achievement. The differences are minor, and when we find any differences at all, it's usually in something like visual spatial, so your ability to fold a box in your head, which is a visual spatial task. Men tend to do that better than women, but it's really very specific skills. It's no longer an achievement. If I showed you this, you'd see no differences in the Woodcock-Johnson in math. Now let me go to reading. Quite different in reading. Women are standard deviation or more above men in reading. If you want to talk about an achievement gap in gender, it's in reading. It is astounding to me how we don't do more with math, but we're okay to have large groups of our population of men not being able to read. So that has been for a very long time. When I talk about how people think about these skills, for some people, if the males have math skills, you don't need to be able to read. The women need to have both math skills and good reading skills. Like that's been true for college. And for those of you who don't spend the time I do looking at higher education, if we were to take the best applications that come in on standardized scores, on outside activities, the kind of things that we look at, it would be by majority women because they score so high, generally on the achievement scores, when we had them, SAT, GRE, and then they do a lot of these other things as well. It really is the case that, and I really would like people to think a lot more about why we are okay having the gender difference we have in reading at standard deviation differences, not small differences, not non-existent differences that we see in math, but very large gaps between the gender in reading. And we just keep going on. And that's fine. We just are okay with that as part of the achievement that we see.
So in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that if a student is struggling in reading, they may get held back, but in math, they just progress to the next grade. Have you seen any studies that show that type of intervention would work with math? Because I know in like the US math system, when you get to middle school, you test into all these different categories like advanced math, regular math, things like that. Does that work at an earlier age, or what interventions do work if that's not the case?
So we have a lot of interventions that have targeted particular, not necessarily national. Those all come through curriculum. And again, curriculum doesn't necessarily come from science. When people get together to decide what the curriculum is, it's a bunch of smart people sitting around the room saying, I think we should do this. Sometimes there's a little bit of science, but mostly there's not science that because the science is all over the place. And so people are like, well, I kind of feel like this is how one should do fractions. And so we get different types of approaches. But when we have gone in and we've gone back and done basic skills, so that, Doug Clements, who's at University of Denver, does this a lot. He's well known for doing these math interventions. You are able to see these dramatic increases. And they literally go in teaching basic skills, because some kids don't know how to count or even put things. When you see the videos, it's kind of hard to watch. Like, they don't know how to put things in line. They don't know how to count pieces. Like, it's going back and teaching them how to do all these basic skills. That does have an impact. The problem is, as soon as all of those resources for that intervention leave the school. So the idea is that you're training the teachers, you're training the schools how to sustain it. As soon as that intervention pulls out, you see a drop back to where they were before. So it can, and then he's gone back in and tried to do these kind of like, what if we come back and train again? Can we like get it back up? You can. Why? The people doing the intervention are in the schools. And as soon as they leave, the teachers in the schools cannot keep that same level. So the interventions we've done haven't been able to be sustained after we've gone in with the interventions. But the results from the intervention look good, just not sustainable. Any other questions? I know. Any other? Ask me about 3 months in the summertime. Okay. So I've been frustrated by this, and I've asked a lot of questions to people who might know, which is, why is it that our schooling is still based on the agricultural system, which is the three months out, when during the Industrial Revolution is when we moved to compulsory schooling, where everyone had to go to schooling. There was a time when we needed people to leave. This is also, by the way, why schools get out at like 3 o'clock. This is all based on the fact that people need to go back and help people either on their farms or in their small businesses. And so you need to have the kids back somewhere to help out the parents. It's been this amazement to me that we continue this system. And I understand that that's because we created summer camps and all kinds of stuff in these 3 months. But this is where I'm a developmental psychologist. I'm not someone from the education. So I talk about things in age versus things in like K through 12, because in the world of developmental, there's not a kindergarten time. There's not a first grade. Those first grade, second grade things are created across a developmental continuum of which kids are learning. And we have kids out of learning environments for 3 months out of the year. And it makes no sense for how we learn about anything we do. So kids who have parents who are putting them into very good cognitive stimulating things in the summer, you see generally, there's always a dip. So for those of you who think about what happens with your kid in the first month, when they go back in schooling, they do review. And they do that review to catch them up, because they lost over those 3 months what they left with. So they have to catch them back up. And then they have to start on the new material for the new year, because we have this huge gap that comes in. Other countries don't do that. You still have lots of time off, like you might have a month in December, you might have a month in May off, but they have continual education, because they don't do this crazy 3 months off in the middle of the year, because there is nothing in the world of cognition and learning that suggests our brains need 3 months of a break. Otherwise, we would get that. You guys should demand that, really. We do that also in higher ed. So when I'm not here on a 12-month thing, I'm on a 9-month contract. Why is colleges at 9 months? And then we have 3 months off. Like, it just doesn't make sense for the kind of what learning does, because we don't need a 3-month lag time. In fact, it hurts a lot of kids that are struggling to have this huge amount of time off without any instruction during that time. So it has, I had hoped during COVID, my one positive was that we would stop this and we would actually rethink the way we did schooling, because this was the time to do it, when these kids were going to definitely come back with learning loss, which were my other 2 ISR talks. And they did, and we just went back to the way it was. So it's not surprising to me that we have this continued learning loss lag, because we don't take advantage of these 3 months that we have to keep kids in constant learn. Well, again, it doesn't have to be 8 hours a day, all day long, but we would have a constant set of learning, which is not what we do. And it is really, you should all wonder about this. Why do we still do it? as a community? I have no idea. It doesn't really help us move kids along. And maybe that's why we continue to have these lags in achievement, because we don't have enough time for kids to learn. Then we take them out of the learning environment for 3 months and then put them back in. And again, there'll be groups of kids that won't recover from those 3 months off. That's what we see with these summer lags coming in. Thank you. Thank you for asking me that. Yeah. Thank you all for coming. I hope, yes, I distracted
Thank
you
you,
for
Pam.
an hour. So, thanks.
Right, reminders of science.